Do you know how to unlock all the power of your crochet or knit gauge swatch? Well, I'm Lindsay from The Lindsay Life, and I'm here to show you how. So, crochet and knit designers are always making swatches. Part of it is to play around with a fabric and find the hook size we like, but part of it is because we know everything you can do once you have that gauge information. Do you want to know how many stitches you need to make a blanket, how many rows, or to get a scarf that's exactly the size you want it? You can figure that all out using the gauge information off of your swatch. So I've got a separate set of videos on how to measure gauge, but now I'm going to talk about how to take that information and find out all the information you need so that you can make your project exactly how you want it using gauge math. Now, hold on a second. If you're like a lot of people I know you think that math is a 4-letter word and you've got like PTSD from middle school math class. I promise you, I'm going to break this down. It's going to be so simple, so easy. You totally can use a calculator. And by the time you're done, you're going to feel so good about what you can accomplish taking the gauge information from your swatch, figuring out exactly how many stitches or how many rows you're going to need to get the measurements you want in your piece. I'm even going to show you how to compensate for starting chains if you're working on a crochet project, and how to deal with stitch multiples. Now, everything I show you is going to be done on this gauge math worksheet that I created. In my other day job, I'm actually a math teacher, so I've really seen what works for people and what doesn't. So I created this worksheet specifically for people who are not math people to be able to take the gauge information and get what they need through using the worksheet. You don't have to use the worksheet. You might find that after you see it on the screen a couple of times, you get the hang of it. If you want, though, you can go straight to thelindsaylifecom, and one of the digital downloads available for purchase is this worksheet booklet. It comes with a blank copy of the worksheet, so you can print out as many of those you need for whenever you need to do gauge math. It comes with the preset samples that I'm going to be doing in this video to teach you how to do gauge math, and it has the answer keys for those. So if you want, you can even pause this video right now, hop on over there, get the PDF, try out the problems, and check your answers with me in the video. If not, that's fine too. Just keep watching, and I'm going to show you how to take your gauge information from your swatch, the desired measurement you want, and figure out how many stitches or how many rows you need to get that measurement. So let's get started. For my first example, I filled in part 1 with the gauge information from my swatch. I had 16 stitches in 4 inches that I measured on my swatch, and I had 8 rows in 4 inches on my swatch. Now let's say I want to use this stitch pattern to make a throw blanket. So I'd love for my blanket to be about 50 inches wide. So in order to calculate how many stitches I need for that, I'm just going to fill in the blanks and follow the worksheet. So my desired measurement is 50 inches. In my gauge section, the number of stitches was 16. And the number of inches for those 16 stitches was 4. So I'm going to go over to my handy calculator, and I'm just going to type this in the order that's in the worksheet. 50 times 16 divided by 4. And my calculator says 200. So yeah, with this fine a gauge, I would need 200 stitches to get a 50-inch wide blanket. Now, sometimes you can just work with that number, but sometimes you need to tweak it a little. So if needed, round to the nearest whole number or the stitch or row multiple. So for this blanket, let's say I want to have an odd number of stitches. 200 is an even number, so I can either go down to 199 or I can go up to 201. So I think for this, it's fine either way. I'm going to go for 199 stitches. Now, because I had to do that rounding and shift it a little to get an odd number of stitches, it means my blanket's not going to be exactly 50 inches. So I can use the part 3 section of the worksheet to figure out exactly what it will be. So for part 3 in the final check, I'm going to use my number from part 2 to check what my actual finished measurement is going to be. So I decided to go with 199 stitches. My gauge inches was 4 inches. Notice how the order is changing here in our formula. The gauge stitches was 16 stitches in that 4 inches. So now I'm going to use my calculator and just plug this in exactly in this order. So 199 times 4 divided by 16. And I get 49.75. So the actual measurement of the width of the blanket, if I have 199 stitches, is 49 inches and 3/4 of an inch. So just shy of 50, but I'm okay with that. Now, sometimes you will get really weird decimals and you may want to round to the nearest 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. I'm okay here. 49 3/4 of an inch is totally good for me. Now, one thing I do want to mention when you're making these calculations for stitches is this is the number of stitches that you need in the first row, not your starting chain number. So for me to have 199 stitches in my first row, I am going to make a little change for my starting chain. It depends on what stitch pattern I'm making. If I'm making rows of single crochet, I'm going to have to add 1 to my starting chain. If I'm making rows of half double crochet, I also add 1 to my starting chain. If I'm making rows of double crochet stitches, I like to add 2. So this would be where you start single crocheting in the 4th chain from the hook, and those skipped 3 chains at the beginning count as the first stitch. Depending on the stitch pattern you're using, you may have to add a different number to figure out your exact starting chain. But after you finish your first row, count and make sure you have this desired number of stitches here. Let's go to the next problem. Now we're going to say I'm working with the same blanket with the same gauge. So 16 stitches for 4 inches and 8 rows for 4 inches. And I'd like it to be 70 inches long. So now I'm talking about the number of rows. So to figure out how many rows, I'm going to put in my desired measurement. Now my gauge rows. So 8 rows in my gauge measurement. The number of inches for those rows, 4, and go over to the calculator again. 70 times 8 divided by 4. So I get 140 rows to get 70 inches. Now, if I'm just working straight rows, that's fine. I can completely do that. But what if I'm making stripes? So let's pretend that I'm making 8 row stripes. Every 8 rows, I change colors. So I want to make sure I finish after a full stripe. So for 8 row stripes, my total number of rows needs to be a multiple of 8. So I'm just going to kind of play around and see what multiples of 8 I can find that are closest. I love to start with 10 because that's the easiest to multiply. You can use a calculator if you want. 8 times 10 is 80. 80 is really far from 140, so I'm going to jump up to 15. 8 times 15, if you plug it into your calculator, you'll get 120. Closer, so let me start going space by space here, or basically one number at a time. 8 times 16 is 128. 8 times 17, you can plug it into your calculator for 136. 8 times 18 is 144. So 144 is more than 140. So I can see the two options that were closest to 140 are 136 and 144. And they're actually pretty equally spaced away from 140. This is 4 less rows, and this would be 4 more rows. So I could choose either one. I think I'll go for 144 rows so that I'll have 18 stripes in my final blanket. That's supposed to be a little zigzag underline, not a number 2. So once again, because I did that change and to get a full stripe at the end, I'm going to use the final check to figure out what my actual length is going to be. So I've decided on 144 rows. In my gauge, my row measurement was 4 inches, and that was for 8 rows. So now I'm going to go over to the calculator. 144 times 4 divided by 8 equals 72. So by finishing that last stripe, I'm going to wind up with a blanket that's actually 72 inches long. And that works for me, and I'm pretty happy with that. Now, these examples had numbers that came out in pretty much nice round whole numbers. So now I'm going to show you an example where we get decimals and that you don't have to be afraid of decimals because we're going to be able to round. For this example, I measured gauge on a different swatch, and I got that 24 stitches was equal to 4 inches. I'm just going to be working with the stitch measurement, so I'm going to leave the row gauge information blank. Now I am making a glove, and I want my glove to be 7.5 inches around, so I need to know how many stitches I need. Just going to fill it in. 7.5 inches is my desired measurement. My gauge stitches are 24, and my gauge inches is 4. I'm going to go over to my calculator to plug that in. 7.5 times 24 divided by 4, and I get 45. I need 45 stitches to get the measurement I want. Now, this project, I'm going to pretend, involves a much more complicated stitch pattern where I need a multiple of 4 stitches plus an extra 2 stitches. So once again, I'm going to start with just kind of what's 4 plus 10? That's 40. And then if I add that extra plus 2, that would be 42 stitches. So I could use 42 stitches with my stitch pattern. What if I did 4 times 11? That would be 44, and then I'd have to add the plus 2, so that would be 46 stitches. That would also work with my stitch pattern. So I calculated I needed 45 stitches. 42 is 3 less, and 46 is 1 more. So 46 is closer. So I'm going to go with 46 stitches. And I'm curious as to what my exact measurement is going to be. So I'm going to go down here and check. My final number I chose was 46. The gauge inches was 4. The gauge stitches was 24. So I'm going to go over to my calculator. 46 times 4 divided by 24. That equals, whoa, that's a long decimal. But we don't have to worry. The great part about this is you can just cut it off midway. So I'm just going to put 7.66. Now, 7.66 is a little bit more than 7.5. So it's just going to be a smidge bigger, so small that I wouldn't even notice the difference on my measuring tape. If I really want to be exact, let's say I'm publishing this pattern, then I'm going to need to round this to the nearest 1/4 inch. Now the 7.66 was actually 7.66 repeating, which if you have flashbacks to middle school was 7 2/3. But that 7.66 going on forever would round up to 7.75. So 7 3/4 of an inch would be the final finished measurement I would list in a pattern. So that's an example where we have decimals, but we can still make everything work. In the next example, I'm going to show you a trick for figuring out those multiple numbers. In this example, I have 11 stitches in 4 inches, and I want my item to be 17 inches wide. So I'm trying to figure out the number of stitches. So I'm going to put in my desired measurement, my gauge stitches, you're getting the hang of this by now, I'm sure, and my gauge inches. And when I come over here to my calculator, I'm going to do 17 times 11 divided by 4. And that's 46.75. So I need around 46 stitches, 46, 47. Well, what if I've got a more complicated stitch pattern that requires a multiple of 8 plus 4 stitches? Now, I could start with 8 times 10 and just kind of guess and go all over the place. Here's my quick trick if I don't want to do that. I'm going to take the whole number part of my answer, 46, and divide it by the multiple number, 8. That gives me a decimal, but I'm just going to look at the whole number part. The whole number part is 5. So I'm going to use the 5 as a starting point for my multiples. 8 times 5 is 40. Add in the extra 4. That's 44 stitches. I'll go down to try 8 times 4. That's 32 plus 4 would be 36. And I'll go up to 8 times 6. That would be 48 plus 4 is 52. Now, my original answer was 46 or 47. That's between 44 and 52. It's a lot closer to 44 than 52. So I'm going to go with 44. Once again, I'm curious what my final actual measurement is going to be. So I'm just going to plug in the numbers. Plug in my final answer from part 2. The gauge inches goes first, then the gauge stitches. Hop over to my calculator. 44 times 4 divided by 11. And I get 16. Wow, that's actually a nice round number. So if I make my piece 44 stitches wide, with this gauge, it'll measure 16 inches, which is actually pretty good considering I wanted 17 inches. So I'm happy with that, and there's no need to round, so there's my final number. I hope you enjoyed this video and learning about the power of gauge and gauge math. Watch my other videos for more great crochet and knit information, and I'll see you next time. Bye.